The hole in the ice was already open. The stick was stuck between his knees, and the wind was blowing so hard that it cut his face like a knife. Mikhail, 17 years old, was shaking, but not with fear yet. The line pulled, he leaned over, and the ground sank beneath his feet. A dry crack, then a hollow sound, and then ice breaking. He fell, half the body in the water. The cold hit like a punch in the chest. Desperation came in the same second. The icy water entered through the boots, through the sleeves of the coat, burning the skin like invisible fire. Mikhail tried to support himself, but the ice around him crumbled into splinters. He held his breath, hands hitting the edges of the hole hard, trying to find purchase. The stick fell. It didn't matter anymore. The head almost submerged. The wind blew snow into the opening, and everything around it looked white and hostile. His body froze faster than he could react. I knew I didn't have time. Nobody lasts long in water like that. In Siberia, they say that 10 minutes is good luck. He gripped the edge tightly. The fingers hurt, but they still obeyed. He pulled his chest out, slipped, hit his shoulder, tried again. The surface seemed to give way with each push. The ice was thick, but not thick enough to support his wet weight. The sled was a few meters away, loaded with a blanket, a knife, dry firewood, and an old tin can. There was his only chance. But to get to it, I needed to get out of the water. The cold didn't just come from outside. He was already in the know. Breathing was short, muscles locked. The face lost sensitivity. The sound of the wind seemed distant, as if it were inside a tunnel. He thought of his father, of the lessons repeated since he was little. On ice, everything is faster, even death. He thought about his grandmother, who always left a candle lit when someone went fishing. Would the candle be lit now, or would it have already gone out with the wind? With a hoarse cry, he pulled the body out. He crawled through the snow, moving away from the hole. The clothes weighed like stone. Every inch was a battle. The eyes watered, but the tears froze before falling. The sled was close. It seemed further away than before. Mikhail gritted his teeth and crawled with the last of his strength. The sky was beginning to darken. He knew that if he didn't reach that blanket, he wouldn't see the next sunrise in Yakutia. The body shook without control. The fingers could barely close. Mikhail crawled to the sled, pulled the blanket with his stiff hands, and tried to curl up as best he could. The skin burned. The cold bit inside. He knew he had little time. The match in his pocket was his last hope. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow and silence, he just wanted to survive another day. There are places where winter doesn't warn. It just takes over. And where do you live? Does the cold make you fight like this too? Comment the name of your city and what winter is like there. Mikhail's hands were shaking so much that he could barely open his jacket pocket. The wet fabric stuck to the skin as if to prevent any reaction. He managed to pull the knife out with effort, the handle already slippery with ice. He stuck the blade into the ground, using it as support to keep himself on his knees. The blanket on the sled was covered with a thin layer of snow, but it was still dry. He pulled it with his teeth and hard fists, wrapping himself around it without delicacy. The rough fabric scratched the skin, but it was better than direct contact with air. His breathing was short, as if his lungs were refusing to function in that cold. The match was in the inside pocket, wrapped in thick plastic, protected by a small metal box inherited from his grandfather, who said that a fire can be worth more than a rifle. Mikhail pulled the box out with difficulty. His fingers no longer had any strength, but he used his mouth to help. He ripped the plastic with his teeth, the skin in his mouth cracking at the cold contact. The sled swayed in the wind, and the snow began to cover everything again. Visibility disappeared. He struck the match with hard hands. The first spark failed. The second one burned crookedly, almost going out with the involuntary blow. The third one lit up. Protected by his body, the small flame danced inside the can where he had already placed dry straw and pieces of birch bark. The smell of smoke rose like hope. The skin began to hurt, a sign that there was still circulation. The blanket, now warm inside, retained minimal heat. Mikhail knew he couldn't sleep. He closed his eyes for seconds and saw his grandmother's house, the wood stove, the smell of herbal tea. He opened his eyes angrily from tiredness. I needed to hold on a little longer, just a little more. The living flame flickered inside the can, small, but enough. The body no longer responded as it used to. His arms were heavy like wet logs, and his legs were barely supporting the weight. Mikhail stuck the knife into the ice and pulled himself up with his shoulders, his teeth grinding, his jaw rigid from the cold. The blanket slipped down his back, soaked at the edges. The flame inside the can trembled, threatening to go out at any gust. The wind whistled through the distant trees, lifting the snow from the ground and throwing it into his face, which burned as if he had been cut. Her eyebrows were white, her eyelashes covered in crystals. Mikhail could no longer see the horizon. Just white and silence. The kind of silence that only exists in Siberia when even sounds stop continuing. He hugged the blanket to his chest, trying to retain the heat that the small makeshift fire was beginning to spread. The wet boots weighed so much that dragging them seemed impossible. But he dragged on. Every inch was an achievement. The fire crackled. Small, fragile, but alive. Mikhail pressed his face close to the can, the steam rising and burning his frozen nose. The skin on my fingers was beginning to crack, but the pain now was a good sign. It meant there was still blood circulating. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, he would sleep. And if I slept, I wouldn't wake up. The wind picked up, throwing snow onto the flame. He leaned over, protecting with his body. The blanket, burnt at the edges, barely covered the shoulders. But it was enough. I just needed to hold on for a few more minutes. Then maybe he would be able to stand. Maybe I could come back. The village still existed somewhere beyond the white. And in Yakutia, sometimes all you have between life and death is a spark. The heat from the flame was almost nothing, but in the middle of the ice, it felt like a miracle. Mikhail stood there, bent over the can, shielding the fire with his arms as the wind roared around him. The blanket stuck to his damp skin, and his body was still shaking, but now there was something different in his eyes. Breathing returned little by little, irregular but steady. He remembered his grandfather sitting by the wood stove, telling stories of hunters lost in the forest, men saved by small gestures, like a dry match or a word spoken at the right time. Mikhail thought about this as he fed the flame with small pieces of straw and dry fibers from his pocket. The fire grew slowly, but it was enough to prevent the cold from extinguishing it from the inside. When the shaking subsided, he looked around. Everything was white. The horizon disappeared in the icy fog. The village was still far away, but it no longer seemed impossible. If he could keep moving, he might have a chance. He tore off a piece of the blanket and tied it to his feet, over his sodden boots. His hands, still stiff, held the knife with renewed firmness. Mikhail struggled to his feet. His legs gave out, but he remained standing. I wouldn't run. I would just walk, one step at a time. He left the can with the fire lit on the sled. Maybe someone would pass by. Maybe not. But that flame deserved to continue. It was more than heat. It was memory. It was Yakutia saying he could go. The cold still hurt. The wind still screamed. But Mikhail walked. And that was winning. Boots pounded heavily on the hard ground. Each step a challenge. Each breath an effort. Mikhail crossed the white field without looking back. The ice crunched low beneath his feet, but now he knew that sound. I knew the weight of danger. The smell of death that the cold brings silently. When the first houses appeared behind the fog, he almost couldn't believe it. He staggered to the fence of his grandmother's house, fell to his knees in the snow, and knocked on the door with his fist. He didn't need to say anything. Grandma pulled him inside, wrapped him in thick cloths, rubbed his hands with warm grease and prayed softly, as if calling his soul back. The fireplace crackled, but the heat didn't come in immediately. It took hours for him to stop shaking. Days until the fingers move again. Mikhail didn't tell everything. I just said the ice gave way. Grandpa just nodded, with deep eyes, as if he had already experienced the same thing. In Yakutia, stories of near death are told respectfully, without fanfare. Life there is borrowed from the cold, and only those who return it carefully follow. Mikhail returned to the lake weeks later. The sled was there, covered in snow, but the can with the burned coal was still in place. He didn't play. He just left a new match, wrapped in plastic, inside the same box, as if to say, now it's someone else's turn. Since then, every time someone talks about fishing, he repeats with the same calmness as someone who has seen the darkness. It's not the ice that kills you. It's the time you think you have. And you, could you survive 10 minutes in water at 71 orders? In places like Yakutia, the cold doesn't warn you. It just arrives and tests who you are inside. Mikhail survived because he listened to the silence, respected time, and lit a flame when everything seemed to be over. And where do you live? Does winter also talk to you this way? Comment here the name of your city and how cold it is there. If this story touched you, like it, Subscribe to the channel and share it with a friend who needs to feel what it's like to face the ice and win.